Welcome everyone to this live stream. Before I begin, make sure that you are settled in yourself, in your pure subjectivity, in your consciousness, in your being, in your heart. Because that is the place in which we communicate and share. That is called the reality, truth. It is your light through which you illuminate your existence. Without that light, you live in darkness, in the world of shadows. Usually, in live streams, I address the most important points from the last retreat, in this case, the online retreat. The last retreat was about realization. The most important subject was the realization of the absolute heart and absolute love. But as some of you who attend the live stream did not attend the retreat itself, it will be difficult to follow, as the subject is very, well, advanced. So I will just mention a few things, the main points. Absolute heart is realized when the previously awakened three hearts, which is the human, celestial in the upper chest, and the divine in the middle, when they become dissolved through activating a very special angelic energy, so that we can enter deeper into the innermost space within our chest, and realize God, because realization of the Absolute Heart is God realization. It's not same as the divine, it is God in whom the divine is naturally present, but he is more. So through Absolute Heart we realize God's nature. And when Absolute Heart enters consciousness, we realize God consciousness. In this live stream, I thought to share certain recent contemplations, especially that soon the physical retreat is coming. So we have made certain circle in that journey of ours into wholeness, into awakening, into love, into healing. Speaking of healing, I wanted to address it a bit, just so you are, however, you need to be aware that that subject will be soon revisited and things will change in the coming retreat. Somehow it needs to be perceived, contained from a deeper place. We have already done a lot of work, but two things are actually missing. certain depth. Depth both of understanding and depth, certain existential depth from which healing needs to be approached. And the second thing that is missing is quite important, and that is simplicity. More simplicity, much more simplicity. When healing becomes overcomplicated, it actually turns against itself. It is actually not healing, it is keeping us in a certain loop, in certain stuckness. Because the very idea that you consider yourself not being healed may cause you perceive yourself in a way that something is wrong with you. So there's no acceptance, there's no self-love, there's no containment of the relative within the unconditional. One of the students mentioned, based on that last retreat in Greece, having an impression, that such impression was given, that healing should precede spiritual awakening, such as to pure subjectivity, or to all those states beyond the mind. I would ask in return a question, a different question. Is it possible to be healed without pure subjectivity? Is it possible to be healed without having no access to one's true self, without having stability inside, without having an actual consciousness? I doubt it. Healing should precede entering the spiritual path for those who are psychologically broken and emotionally fragmented. Such people cannot enter the spiritual path because they are simply too disturbed. So they need to reach certain psychological balance first before beginning to meditate. healing and awakening should be mutually inclusive. In order to have balance, equilibrium. Of course, sometimes the inner work with consciousness, being, and so forth needs to be prioritized. Sometimes healing needs to be more prioritized. But generally speaking, they should go hand at hand. Healing is not something absolute. There's nothing absolute in human reality. Healing is relative. It's about balance. It's about transcending the irrational. It's about going beyond the reactive mind that is responding based on past negative experiences. One should not think that by reaching healing or arriving at the place where one feels more or less healed, which is again a relative term, that all the human suffering is dissolved. Healing does not dissolve suffering, it dissolves the unnecessary suffering. The suffering that we are causing ourselves by being irrational and emotionally immature. Healing points to two areas. One is how we experience ourselves, within ourselves, psychologically. And second area is how we interact with the world. Human, other human beings, and with the world in general. How we live in the world, how we perceive it. In both these areas, negativity, the negativity that we generate unnecessarily, need to be dissolved. But the foundation of healing still is our relationship with our own self, because we are the foundation. If that relationship is corrupted, we will be generating pain. This is why in one of the retreats I spoke about the realization of pure goodness within ourselves, which is the very foundation of our sanity and unconditional well-being, space from which, the only space from which healing actually can occur, and that which is psychologically and emotionally redundant, unnecessary, that which is constitutes a psychological burden can be dropped. But healing will not eliminate fully suffering, because suffering is part of this reality. Certain suffering. Suffering will be minimized, but cannot be fully eliminated, because it is a part of that matrix of imperfection in which we are living. Suffering was, or transcendence of suffering, elimination of suffering, was subject of many religions or spiritual systems, such as Buddhism. And it's quite interesting, actually. That human effort to somehow seek that relief from suffering and different technologies developed in order to serve this purpose, such as spiritual awakening in terms of entering space in consciousness, primarily beyond the mind, space of transcendence, which is a complex subject because there are so many states. So I'm now just speaking in general. And then based on that, this identifying from our human existence, negating it as lower, in order to arrive at the state of egolessness or humanlessness, but it does not work. It does not work because it's not true, because it is in conflict with what we are, how we have been created. And we are what we are. We are many things, but being human is one of them. You cannot avoid it, you cannot repress it, and whatever disidentification you will cultivate from the human will remain artificial, unnatural. So we have healing, which does not fully dissolve suffering. We have space of transcendence beyond the mind, which does not give us absolute freedom, because we are still humans. And somehow these two have to meet. We need to experience our human nature from our transcendent nature, from that which is beyond human. It is still us, but a larger self, deeper self, rooted in the beyond. But the kind of beyond that is also here, because everything is here. Beyond is a relative term in the eye of the beholder, the angle of perception, the place from which you perceive. One of the goals of healing, if not the most important, is to allow that integration between the human and the transcendent. So that the human can be embraced from a deeper place, but also can be infused with our transcendent self. Otherwise these two always clash, they are separated. That separation has to be dissolved. There are those who try to heal, but they do not strive for spiritual awakening, and there are those who try to awaken and then negate their human existence and push it aside as lower, as ignorance, as ego, and whatnot. But both of these approaches are extreme and imbalanced. If we want to be whole, everything has to be unified. So, we live in imperfection. Things are not always working the way we want. Some of our emotional and other needs are not met. There's always an element of frustration or disappointment. There are conflicts. They're also inevitable in this reality if you live in the world. And that's all right. But the question is from which place you experience that certain level of human dissatisfaction. Of course, there's not always dissatisfaction, but often there is. Human reality is imperfect because creation is, the element of imperfection is embedded in it. So in a way, there's suffering here. Suffering, not that you always suffer, because you can experience happiness and joy and beauty, but from the God's perspective, imperfection is suffering. From God's perspective, our happiness is a form of suffering. Our joy is a form of suffering, because it's all imperfect. It's just our relative interpretation of our mental or emotional states, that we consider ourselves being happy or not. From the God's perspective, because this is what I wanted to talk about as well, about God. The closer we come to ourselves, the closer we come to God. The closer we come to God, the closer we come to ourselves. The more we understand ourselves, the more we understand God. And the more we understand God, the more we actually begin to understand ourselves. There are many theories about God, many ideas about God, monotheism, pantheism, which is that creation is God, panentheism, which means that creation is in God. Human beings are very they have a great intellectual imagination to conceive of such things. And it's not that these theories are right or wrong. That's not the issue. The issue is that they are intellectual constructs. And to understand truly, on a deeper level, God, who He is, we need to feel it. But our capacity for feeling is also limited through our access to reality. That's why the deeper you are spiritually awakened, which is you have more access to reality, the more you can feel. And then from that feeling, you can understand. Of course, to understand God's mind is pretty much impossible. We can understand a little bit, but not the whole of it, because as humans, we are quite on the periphery of creation, but we can feel God, and we can experience God. We can experience God's nature as our own, because we are made from God. We are God as He is experiencing Himself as us in the creation, in our individuality. Creation is God. Creation is beauty. It's an amazing journey of God into manifestation. And the end of this journey, or one of its main purposes is for creation to return to God through us. Creation is God, but God is more than creation. He exists in his own eternal bliss and unfathomable intelligence. People often ask how God could create the world and there is so much suffering, and he does not care, he does not help. You may have often experienced as if your prayers were not answered, or they were not answered for various reasons. God created this universe, but he is also this universe. That suffering which exists in this universe, that's part of it, is God's suffering. So it's not that he, from his eternal bliss, somehow irresponsibly created the reality of suffering, and now we all have to struggle. No. Our suffering is his suffering. So in that sense, creation was his great sacrifice. He sacrificed himself. When you are suffering, God is suffering. In fact, he is suffering even more in the sense that when you think that you are happy, he knows it is suffering. It is imperfection. When you understand that, when you can have some kind of an intuitive insight into that truth, not from the mind, but from that transcendent intelligence in yourself, then you can understand the other side of that equation. As God is suffering, or feeling suffering in creation, through creation, suffering is not something bad. Suffering is just imperfection. So in the same way, we have to transform our relationship with suffering from within our own. God's nature. It's not our own, but it is experienced through us. call it godly suffering. Godly suffering is when you experience imperfection of this reality, or occasional discomfort of living here, or dissatisfaction with different things. You need to experience it from the God within yourself, from the inner bliss. You need to experience your reality in a way, and your reality is more personal, naturally, in the same way as God is experiencing creation. On one level, you are not affected, because you are free, you are in the state of bliss. On the other hand, you do experience certain discomfort, and you embrace it. You are not repressing it, you are not negating it, you are not trying to disconnect from it, renounce it. That is not the way. That is not the way of wholeness. The way of wholeness is to experience everything as truth. God's nature is realized through the absolute heart, but you can, even without that, you can experience different dimensions of God that are more represent how he extended himself into creation, because there are different bridges. For instance, universal consciousness is one of the bridges for God into creation. So by connecting to those bridges, to those extensions of God, you can, even though in a limited level, you can still experience the truth of what I am saying. So here, as you can see, that transcendence is not about escaping, running away, or pushing away part of yourself, which is more relative, and identifying with that which is more unconditional. No, those states of transcendence actually allow you to experience this reality fully and as it should be experienced. So in terms of suffering, it's not, as Buddha wanted, to end suffering. For noble truth, there's a suffering cause and a way to end it, and the end of it. No, you don't want to end suffering, because to end suffering means to end creation. Everything which is relative is imperfect, and creation is relative. They're just simply different levels of how imperfect things are. Some are more imperfect than others, obviously. There's a gross level of suffering, and there's more subtle, more etheric level of suffering. and you want to experience whatever is as it is, as truth. But for that, you need to be in the space of transcendence. And you see, there's this movement from ignorance, from forgetfulness, to remembrance, to awakening. You are very familiar with the concept. But there's the opposite movement, from that awakening, from that space of transcendence, movement towards creation. Towards your human reality, towards your human nature. And this is where these two converge. And you experience reality as it is. Without separation, without dualities, without having to make spiritual or mental choices or preferences, you experience reality as it is, choicelessly. You don't have to choose. Things just are. The space of transcendence actually allows you to experience things as they are. Human reality, as I said, is not just suffering, there's beauty, joy, love. Sense of adventure, and many other things. But there's also suffering. I use the term suffering in two ways. One as a general description of the state of imperfection. So in that sense, everything is what is the word, estranged from the God's bliss. That's why it's suffering. You could say everything which is not God's bliss is suffering. And second meaning of the word suffering is the usual interpretation. Not feeling so good here. Being dissatisfied with things. Feeling emotionally deprivated. Somehow the sense that all the time something is missing. Nothing can fill you up in this reality, including emotionally, or above all emotionally. So you just keep distracting yourself in order just not to feel that fact, not to feel that lack. The general interpretation of suffering as state of imperfection, let's put aside. Let's now just address suffering as it is usually interpreted. Changing your relationship with that suffering is of the essence. When you change your relationship with that suffering, and the foundation of that relationship should be complete surrender to your unconditional self, be it your God's nature, your God's bliss, depending, of course, how much access you have to it. When you change your relationship with suffering, suffering changes the relationship with you, and itself, that sense of suffering becomes transformed. Not that it disappears entirely, even though it may as well. It becomes transmuted into something else. And it is experienced from the place of godly acceptance. Embracing your suffering in a godly manner is actually the highest expression of humility. And innocence. As God is experiencing creation that emerged from His great sacrifice, the price He had to pay was suffering, which is all right, as in return He received the joy, the grandeur of evolution. So that through that evolution, through that creation, which is part of Him, which is Him as manifested, He is in that eternal journey of returning back to Himself as His unchanged being. As uncreated. God was not created, even though He is not the source of Himself. He emerged from the primordial, spontaneously. And then He became the Creator. So as God is experiencing creation from His ground center of being, so in the same way you need to experience your reality from the center of your being, and you, at some point your being should merge with being of God. So that truly you begin to experience your human reality, including suffering, in a godly manner. That's why I created the term godly suffering. It's all a new way of looking, and what is the most amazing about this new way of looking, that it is actually true. To experience godly suffering does not mean just that you experience human imperfection, the imperfection of human reality from the space of transcendence, which you embody, should embody. Not just that. There would be too much aloofness to that position. You need to as well be one with your human nature. So you are experiencing your human nature from your human nature, and you experience your godly nature from your godly nature, and the separation between these two is forgotten. But if you disconnect from your godly nature, from the space of transcendence, your deeper self, and then you rationalize your suffering as godly suffering, saying, oh, my suffering is godly and I am experiencing it in a godly manner, the place of godly acceptance, then this is false, because your suffering is ungodly. It becomes godly. So ungodly suffering is a suffering experienced by multitude of beings and forms of life that have no existential or conscious connection to the God's being. But paradoxically, so that is from their perspective, you see, because from the God perspective, all of the suffering is godly because it's his suffering. So from his perspective, it is godly. From their perspective, it is not. So, actualizing your God's nature within yourself in a conscious manner as the eternal state of bliss within yourself is where these two perceptions, these two paradigms of experiencing of reality converge, the one of God and the one of yours. And that's the beauty of it. That's what's so amazing here. I hope it makes sense to you, and or at least it inspires you to explore that truth of which I spoke, because it is a truth. It's not a theory. It's not a mental, intellectual invention. It is truth. If you are able to experience godly suffering, even in a limited way, to a limited level, your relationship with suffering will change. You'll not fight with this. You'll not repress it. In fact, you will have a sense of upliftment in experiencing of it, because you begin to experience your own suffering, not just your own, but the suffering also of others through God. And then there will be peace. And certain sense of astonishment. Because all that suffering that was always your enemy, your foe, you've been battling with, your nemesis, will become love. May God, your Creator, bless you all.